can I have your enthusiastic and warm welcome for Cavoukian, please?
I'm going to walk you through what I intend to talk to you about, and I will go quickly because I'm going to be covering a lot of different areas. But what I want to emphasize is that privacy is absolutely essential to our future as free and democratic societies. If you value freedom, then you value privacy. You may not be aware of it, but I hope to show you the relationship. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about privacy by design, which is something I developed back in the 90s, but it really gained momentum actually after 9/11. And then I'll tell you about how we've operationalized privacy by design. I was mentioning to one of my colleagues that many years ago I developed something called practical privacy, because in my world, I'm no longer the privacy commissioner, but I have been for a very, very long time, for 3 terms. And in that world, privacy has to be practical. The measures we introduce have to work on the ground now, or they're of very limited value. And so practical privacy is absolutely key, and you'll see privacy by design relates very closely to that. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Then I'm going to tell you about big data analytics. Just by way of background, I was the Information and Privacy Commissioner in Ontario, Canada, for many years, over 3 terms, 17 years, and I was the assistant commissioner before that, so like a lifetime. But I recently changed 6 weeks ago because I decided after completing my 3rd term, it was time for a new gig, as we call it at home. I don't know if that translates here. A new venture. And so I let it be known I didn't want to keep doing the same thing, and I got lovely offers we have wonderful universities in Toronto, Canada, but I got an offer I couldn't refuse from Ryerson University, which was they were going to open up a new big data institute, and they wanted me to head it. And I met with the president who made me the offer, and I said, but Sheldon, what about privacy? And he said, Commissioner, think of it as a blank page, fill it any way you want. And I said, I want to call it the Privacy and Big Data Institute, where big data meets big privacy. And you'll see when you hear about privacy by design, the central theme of privacy by design is I urge you to reject zero-sum propositions where it's an either or. You can have privacy or big data, privacy or security. That is so fundamentally flawed. I want you to reject that in favor of what I call positive sum paradigms, which enable multiple functionalities to be performed at the same time. Privacy and big data, privacy and security, and I hope to show you how we've operationalized that in a number of different areas. This is real. It's not a theoretical construct. You can do this now, and I hope to walk you through that. So let's just take a look at what do we mean by privacy? And it is so integrally related to control, an individual's control over the uses of his or her data. Personal control is absolutely critical, and diminishing it would appear at a very rapid pace. It ties very closely to freedom of choice. You cannot have freedom if you can't exercise some control over the uses of your personally identifiable information. The Germans have a wonderful term for this. They call it informational self-determination. Big term, simple concept. And they enshrined this in their constitution in 1983 because it was so important to the Germans. And it's essentially that it should be the individual who determines the fate of his or her personal information. Not the state, not your husband, not your mother. The individual gets to determine this. And I've worked very closely with my German colleagues over the years. It is no accident that Germany is the leading data protection country in the world. It is no accident that they had to endure the abuses of the Third Reich and the complete cessation of all of their freedoms. They have never forgotten that, and they have retained that lesson then and now. Never again. Never again will we lose our freedom. Never again will we lose our privacy. Let me just tie this theme one more time in the context of societal well-being and prosperity, because people often think of privacy as being an individual human right, which it is, but it also has enormous societal value. And I think sometimes that gets overlooked in the equation. innovation, creativity, and the prosperity that results from that, all of this requires freedom. And in order to achieve that, you must have privacy. Human rights, our freedoms, civil liberties, the conceptual engines of innovation and creativity, none of this would exist without privacy. And what we know is that the antithesis of privacy is surveillance. When someone is looking at you constantly, all of your activities are being watched and surveilled. We know this from the academic literature. It alters the way that you behave. And I refer to cognitive bandwidth because I'm a psychologist. That's my background. Your cognitive bandwidth is relatively limited, and when you feel you are constantly being watched, you alter your behavior in a manner that you hope conforms with what is being expected. Freedom, liberty, creativity, innovation, they go out the window. And we know this historically, having studied it at times when situations have changed. And that's another absolutely essential reason why we need privacy. If freedom isn't enough, the future is absolutely essential in terms of creativity and the innovations that will arise. You know, people often say to me, well, you know, if you have nothing to hide, then you have nothing to fear, right? What's the big deal? What's wrong with the state having access to all of your information? You know, in North America, which I'm from Canada, of course, I'm in the United States a lot, so I'm talking to my US colleagues a lot ever since the revelations of Edward Snowden. And at the beginning, a number of solid citizens in the States would say to me, but if you have nothing to hide, what's the big deal? And I'd say, let's just unpack that for a moment. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, means that the state is entitled to access all of your information because you have nothing to hide, right? You haven't broken a law, there's no issue, so what's the problem? The problem is that it's predicated on this faulty logic that the state has a right to access all your information. That is the opposite of freedom. That is the opposite of the societies that we live in. If you break the law, yes, you forfeit your privacy. But if you're a law-abiding citizen going about your business, you are entitled to live as you wish, free and unencumbered from the state or others. And that is the essential flaw with if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, is that everything is intended to be out in the open. If everything is intended to be out in the open, I mean, just look at your lives for a moment. I'm sure you're all upstanding citizens. There are portions of our lives that require reflection and solitude and intimacy and reserve. These are the times often when the creative juices flow and personal interactions develop. That's not intended for public view unless you decide you want to put it out in the public eye. So just a small background. Let's talk about privacy by design. As I mentioned, I developed this a long time ago, back in the 90s, but it really took off after 9/11 because it was just abundantly clear to me after 9/11 that we had to get this out in a big way to change the paradigm. When 9/11 happened, I remember I was in the hospital. I just had some surgery, and my assistant called me, and she said, quick, turn the TV on. And I did, just in time to see the second tower and the plane going into it. And I thought, oh my God, this is the death knell for privacy unless we act quickly. And I remember getting on the phone talking to some of my colleagues in the United States, and everyone was afraid to indicate their support for privacy in any way for fear of being considered to be unpatriotic. That was the opposing forces of privacy versus security, privacy versus public safety, that you can't possibly have both. And so we escalated this forward. I had developed what I called 7 foundational principles of privacy by design, but we hadn't really driven it out in a big way, and we did. In 2010, privacy by design was unanimously passed as an international standard for privacy. So once a year, privacy commissioners and data protection authorities get together for an annual conference, which is largely open, but at the last day we have closed sessions to vote on various resolutions that are advanced. And I've been going to these for many, many years. It's not a slam dunk that your resolution is going to be advanced, I assure you. I remember before taking the stage to advance privacy by design, the speaker before me advanced the notion that French should become the second official language of the conference, which didn't strike me as being a big deal because, especially in Canada, we're bilingual. Canada's second language, not a big deal. It was a huge deal. The Mexicans, the Spanish, were very upset because the conference the year before had been in Spain, and the year after it was going to be in Mexico. So they said Spanish should be the official second language. The Germans said, what, are you kidding me? Germany is the leading data protection country in the world, which it is. The Germans have gone to great lengths to protect privacy and data protection. German should be the second language. So debate on, continued for about 45 minutes. And then the item was deferred for further consideration, which means it was dead. So then I had to take the podium. I was trembling because I really wanted this to pass. I made a small presentation, and what amazed me, we had about 20 minutes of discussion. It was passed unanimously. And what surprised me about that was, nothing gets passed unanimously, but it really made it clear to me that commissioners around the world, who up until then had largely been focused on a regulatory compliance model of protecting privacy. You have the laws, you examine the fact situation against the law, section 31 sub 2A, and if there's a breach, you offer some system of redress. All very, very important. But it's it had been very legalistic until then. Privacy by design is not legalistic. It's all about embedding protections into the design of technology, into your data architecture. And so what I was so pleased about was that obviously commissioners from around the world, regulators, understood that we could no longer protect privacy simply by relying exclusively on a system of regulatory compliance. We also all realized that the most we were getting as regulators was the tip of the iceberg, the cases that actually floated to the top and we could actually investigate. The majority of the infractions are below sea level, and they're proliferating and growing in this day and age of ubiquitous computing and mobile connectivity, and everybody's online. It just simply wasn't possible. So all of this led to the passage of PBD. And the great news, it's been translated now into 37 languages, and I'm so delighted with this. And this was all at the request. I put it out there, I put a request out. If various countries would kindly agree and would translate, and they did. So we've had remarkable success. And I'll just give you one example. Not a week would go by in my former life as commissioner where some country wouldn't contact me about something relating to privacy by design. And when we first developed this, I thought the terminology of positive sum instead of zero sum might be a little too difficult to float very high, and I thought, well, maybe I should change that, but I did my graduate work at a time when game theory was really big, and this is all the resounding terminology. So we left it in. And in May of this year, I got this wonderful letter. And, oh wait, let me just go to it first. I got this from JIPDEC. JIPDEC is the Japanese Information Processing Development Center. And I was just floored by this. It's just a lovely, lovely tribute to privacy by design. But I've got to read you the quote. We've heard from Japan's private sector companies that we need to insist on the principle of positive sum, not zero sum, and become enlightened with privacy by design. This was just so gratifying. I can't tell you that not only the terminology, but obviously the mindset and the methodology was being contemplated. Now, let me see if I can go back. As I mentioned earlier, the essence of privacy by design is being proactive and protecting privacy in a preventative way, but in a positive sum way, in a way that enables multiple functionalities to take place. I've talked to many engineers, computer scientists, and they've essentially told me, Bruce Schneier is a dear colleague, and I remember him saying, it's a false dichotomy. It's rarely the case that we can't do both. But the biggest complaint that I hear from engineers and computer scientists is we need to be told at the beginning, when you're asking us to write the program, develop the code, that's when we need to know that you want us to embed privacy. it's beautiful. They said, of course we can do it. You know, we're smart. They're confident. It's wonderful. But obviously, you have to advise them at the time that you're asking for the design to be developed. And that way you can get rid of the false dichotomies, you can get rid of the unnecessary trade-offs, and have both necessary fundamentals embedded into the systems you're creating. A couple of years ago, I called it the Year of the Engineer, and I went around the world almost exclusively talking to engineers and computer scientists, because I really wanted to make sure that this could fly, what I was asking for. And it was a resounding yes. I didn't meet one engineer who said, we can't do this. It was almost a trivial question to them, provided that they had the information that they needed at the outset when they're developing the data architecture. And so I took that very strongly, and I reflected the comments of various academics when they talk about the power of and. When you get rid of the versus, pitching one thing against another and substituting and, you will have a much, much better protocol. Now, let me make it clear. It's more difficult, there's no question. I'm asking you to do more, but the end result is so far superior that, to me, it's a slam dunk. So this is my JIP deck comment. Now let me walk you through what exactly is privacy by design. There are 7 what I call foundational principles, and to me it's very basic. It's like motherhood. It's all about being proactive, embedding the necessary protections into the design of the technology or business practice or operational process, whatever it is that you're engaged in. And I'll tell you afterwards, if we have time, the number of businesses who have approached me, who have worked with me and done this with great success. It will lead to a competitive advantage for businesses that do this and build this into their business practices. The hard part is embedding privacy as the default setting. I think that's the most challenging part, because first of all, the beauty of privacy as the default setting is that people don't have to worry about it. Users, data subjects, customers, they don't have to go and try to find the opt-out box and read the privacy policy, which we know nobody does anymore. They don't have to look up the terms of service, which are like systems of legalese. Let's get real. Who does that? I don't know anyone who does that. I do it because it's my job, but apart from that, I wouldn't do it. And so privacy as the default setting offers people privacy assurance that, given no action on their part, they can be assured of privacy when they use a particular program. And that's the enormous attraction of it. And that's why you have to talk to your coders, your engineers, right at the outset. Because if you're going to embed it as a default setting, all the necessary protections have to be done right from the beginning. Absolutely critical. You have to embed it into design in a way that is seamless and works effortlessly with the other functionalities that you're programming for. I've talked a lot about positive sum, not zero sum. I cannot tell you the enormous benefits of that. I've been doing this for a long time now, over 20 years. And the beauty of having this, almost this outlook, this philosophy, is it will always give you a seat at the table. I'll give you an example. Many, many years ago, I was asked to join the board of the European Biometrics Forum. And I was surprised, honored, but surprised, because Europe, there are hundreds of outstanding privacy commissioners, just wonderful. And I said, why are you coming to me instead of one of your own? And they said, it's simple. They said, you don't say no to biometrics. You say yes to biometrics, and here are the privacy protective measures I insist that you place into your programs. They said, we can live with that. We may not like it, but we can live with it. What we can't live with is if you say no to biometrics. I mean, obviously that's our livelihood, so that's something we can't contemplate. And having worked with them over the years, we've developed a wonderful system of biometric encryption, which I'm not going to have time to talk about, but take a look at our website. It uses the biometric as the instrument of coding. It is the unique characteristics of the biometric serve to code some other nonsense information, a 100-digit PIN number, an alphanumeric, it doesn't matter. And that's what gets retained in the database, not the digital template of your finger, which acts as an identifier. And if the police come knocking, there's a crime in the neighborhood, they want access to your database and they have a warrant, of course you have to give them the information. But with biometric encryption, what do they get? They don't get the biometric. It's just a brilliant system, but it performs the value of what the biometric is needed for. So I give that as an example that you can do this in a very useful way, and you will always get a seat at the table. I can't tell you the number of times I have had the enormous benefit of being able to offer some privacy comments because of this view, and sometimes it's that simple. End-to-end security. I can't emphasize this enough. While privacy subsumes a much broader set of protections than security alone, if you don't have strong security, you can't have good privacy. It starts with strong essential security. End-to-end, full lifecycle protection from collection of the data to secure destruction. Absolutely critical. We've got 2 papers that we did last year with Oracle on privacy and security by design. Visibility and transparency. This is so important for data subjects, for the actual individuals whose data is being collected, customers, citizens, whoever. They have to know what you're doing with their information. Remember, it's not your information. You may have custody and control over the data you collect, but you don't own the data. That relates that the data belong to the data subject. So they have to be advised of what you're doing with the data. The transparency is critical, and the openness. And finally, respect for user privacy. I think this goes without saying. If you create products and services that are user-centric and focused on the user, you're golden, because that's what privacy is all about. Remembering what's at the heart of all of this is the individual whose data you're now using. Operationalizing privacy by design, we wrote this paper a few years ago because we wanted to stem the tide of people saying, well, this privacy by design thing is a great concept, but how real is it? It's not walking on the ground. The hell it's not. In my world, it's got to walk on the ground right now. Otherwise, it has very limited value. So we have partnered with all the major companies, Intel, Oracle, IBM, Microsoft, HP, Google, Facebook. I mean, we've worked with all of them. I'm sure we haven't worked with all of them, but a lot of the big ones. And they have come to us and said, here's the idea we have. We want to work with you. Remote home health care. I'll never forget watching this. That was with Intel. We did an amazing paper. So imagine you're an elderly individual and you want to stay at home. You want to stay in your home. You don't want to go to a nursing home. But obviously you have concerns. You live alone. What if you get up in the middle of the night to use the restroom and you don't make it back to your bed? What happens? So Intel devised wonderful, brilliant remote home healthcare sensors that could be placed, for example, in the bed that would identify someone of your choosing if, in fact, you didn't return to the bed in the middle of the night after a preset period of time. That would alert emergency or your home care people, whoever you decide. I remember I was watching this on the news a couple of years ago, and I think it was ABC News, anyway, in North America, and they were saying how wonderful a story this was, how enormously valuable it will be to the elderly, and so if you have to give up privacy, so be it. The value was such that it was outstanding. I just hit the roof because I knew you didn't have to give up privacy to get this. You could do both. So it always reverts back to that zero-sum proposition. You can do both. And I knew the medical consultant who was commenting on this. And I contacted her and I said, Nancy, you can have both. She said, oh my God, how can you have both? So I walked her through the paper we had done with Intel and the enormous protections Intel was putting in to ensure that the data could only be used for the intended purposes. One of the essentials of privacy is primary use. Use the data for the intended purpose, no secondary uses without the consent of the data subject. So I walked her through the way we had done this. And she was delighted, as we were, because you can have multiple functionalities again and again. That's what I emphasize. And when I get to big data, you'll hear the same messaging. And here we are at the world of big data. So it's funny, in my new life, and it is a very new life, about 6 weeks. Oh, and by the way, my Twitter handle has changed. I think it's now Privacy Big Data, at Privacy Big Data, something like that. Anyway, so as you know, enormous interest in big data, enormous opportunities, and so much will be revealed. Health research will advance, other areas of research will advance. Here's this entirely new concept. How new is this concept? Well, actually, if you read some of the literature, it's not that it's a new concept. I mean, people have been doing data mining and data analytics for many years, but it's hit the media, and the media love it, and it is this big thing. Okay, great. I'm not going to quibble over words. Data analytics are growing. The field of data scientists is growing. It appears that there are not enough data scientists for the needs of all the companies who are now investigating this area. So everyone is attracted to it. I actually, believe it or not, am a big fan of data analytics and research. As I said, I'm a psychologist. In my day, when I was doing psychology, experimental design was very big. Statistical analysis in the traditional ways was very big. You know, you would get a sample and you'd make sure it was a representative sample of the population you were looking at. You would start off with a hypothesis, a theory, and don't underestimate the value of theories. But I'll get to that later. And then you would test and you would do all these things to ensure the quality of the data was sound. So I'm very big into research and the value of analysis. But we can't forget what can also happen. You know, there's always another side. And the other side in this is the enormous possibilities for expanded surveillance. As I mentioned, Mr. Snowden has made my life much easier these days because I no longer have to make the case that surveillance can have enormous repercussions. No one is opposed to using surveillance to catch the bad guys, the terrorists. That's not the issue. But in the process of doing this, how wide do you cast the net? And what do you do with false positives? The NSA, they don't talk about the false positives. False positive is saying so-and-so is a terrorist, and in fact they're not. It's a false hit. Their lives can be ruined until they clear their name. Half the time, they don't even know they've been identified to clear their name. There are enormous repercussions that can arise. So I just like to point out some of the negatives that we have to be mindful of to ensure that the true positives are actually what we end up getting. Now, here's what I like to talk about in the context of big data. Whenever there's some new thing that arises, and as I said, big data is not new itself, but the term has really grown in terms of the media. So I always say first comes the honeymoon, and the honeymoon usually is great. It better be, otherwise, don't bother with the rest of it. Big data is going to rule the world. Everything else, step aside. If I could tell you the number of times I've seen the death of privacy being, but yet again, predicted, this time because of big data. And I'm the kind of person, every time I see it, I have to write a letter to the editor, I have to write to whoever's making the false prediction. One of the things that has been of concern to me is the lack of desire, it seems, to actually explore causality as opposed to correlation. Big data is predicated on predictive analysis, huge correlations with massive sample sizes. Sometimes the sample size, it's the N of 100. You get the entire population. So people are saying, well, you don't have to worry about causality. You've got the whole population or a large number. You don't have to worry about it. I actually think you do have to worry about it. I also think you can't give up on certain aspects of it. I had this big running fight at the beginning of this year with Victor Meyer-Schomburger, an excellent researcher, and he wrote a great book called something like Big Data, the big revolution that's going to transform the world. That's not the exact title, but something like that. I read it over Christmas, and it was very interesting. I thought the chapter on privacy could have been stronger, but all in all, it was a very interesting book. And then in January, I heard a video presentation. I watched the video on TV. He was making a presentation at an IAPP conference in Brussels. I couldn't be there, so I just watched the video. And he was basically saying, he wasn't saying so much forget about privacy, but he was saying forget about collection. You no longer have the means to protect data at the collection source because there are such massive data sets, and it's just so rampant out there. You're just not, the genie's already left the bottle. Forget about trying. Let's just focus on holding companies and governments, hopefully, accountable for the use of the data, and forget about collection and de-identifying data and things of that nature. When I saw this video, I hit the roof. I cannot tell you, my reaction was over the top. And the first thing I did, and this is what I always do, I call a colleague who I want to partner with to write a paper immediately to offer a different view. So I contacted my wonderful colleague, Alexander Dix, Data Protection Commissioner of Berlin, Germany. And I said, Alexander, I'm not going to tell you my reaction to the video I'm sending you. Please watch it. And if your views are similar to mine, I want to do something. And he said, okay, I'll call you back. So he watches it, calls me back, and he's laughing. And he said, Anne, I know your reaction. And I said, do you share it, Alexander? He said, yes, but of course. And we wrote a paper together called something like Privacy Paternalism, the Unintended Consequences. You see, when you take the view that you can no longer protect the privacy at the source where the data emanates. Basically, you give it up. Any notion of personal control goes out the window. Any notion of traditional means through technology of protecting the data out the window. Basically, you're giving it up. Because if your answer is, well, you give it to the regulator who will offer some system of redress, oh my God, that would triple our workload easily, and resources are shrinking, not expanding. I assure you, we would not be able to get a handle on this. And as I mentioned, the tip of the iceberg gets smaller and smaller. It would simply be beyond our means, and privacy infraction would be rampant. So we wrote a paper identifying the concerns we had with this. And before the paper got out, I responded. There's something called the IAPP daily newsletter that comes out. And I wrote a critique of Victor Meyer-Schomburger's position, and he wrote back, and he said, I didn't mean that, and I then wrote back, and I said, I'm so glad you didn't mean that, and we had this back and forth, so I am not one of his favorite people. That's fine. But the point was, we drove home, with the paper that I do with Dr. Dix, we drove home the position that you can protect data at source. There are amazing de-identification protocols that will de-identify the data sets and then enable the data to be used for data analytics of a variety of different types and research of a variety of different types. And this is really, really important. You may have read some of the work that has come out recently that says, well, don't bother de-identifying data because the risk of re-identification is there, and we can re-identify the data sets. So why are you bothering? Here's why you bother. First, let me be very clear. There is no such thing as zero risk. I call it the myth of zero risk. Where in life is there zero risk? I mean, let's get real. But if you strongly de-identify the data using strong de-identification protocols, not just the obvious ones, you can minimize the risk dramatically to less than 1%, often less than 0.01%, which is, staggering, tiny risk. That risk I'm willing to adopt. So we have this back and forth. We are offering at Ryerson University, I'm putting on a de-identification symposium with Professor Khaled El-Imam. He is one of the world's renowned de-identification experts. We're offering this on October 21st. If you have any interest, it's going to be webcast. You can take a look at it. So then the honeymoon ends, as I mentioned. And now, I'm just going to go through this very quickly. So many comments are emanating just in the last little while about the problems. Well, first, they embrace big data, and they're doing all this amount of, throw a lot of money into big data, and many of the programs sputter or fail completely. A lot of digital data analytics works on what they call the digital exhaust. It's data that results from other data being collected for other purposes. And they're finding there are a lot of flaws with this in terms of making the connections. How good is the data? Gartner recently said that big data is moving from the inflated expectations phase to a trough of disillusionment. Ah, what a staggering criticism. Professor Sandy Pentland, Alex Pentland, often called Sandy Pentland, said at MIT, we need a new deal on data. We need individuals to own their own data and control how it's used and distributed. So all of a sudden, you've got these people who are big proponents of big data coming out with stinging criticisms. I won't go through all these, but at Cambridge University, Professor Spiegelhalter, I love this one because he was saying that while the promise of big data is also big, the problem is if we ignore statistical lessons that we should be very familiar with. The small data problems also occur in big data, but he said they don't disappear because you've got lots of data. They get worse. So this gives you an idea of the stinging indictment that is coming out. I was just reading an earlier version of in The Economist. They wrote an article on this, the backlash of big data. I'm just going to read you one little quote. They said, behind the big data backlash is the classic hype cycle in which a technology's early proponents make overly grandiose claims, then people sling arrows when those promises fall flat. And maybe that's what we're dealing with now. I don't want you to abandon big data. I want you to embrace big data analytics and ensure that privacy is embedded into the process. I want it to be a win-win. Another one, forget big data, was need is good data. We need quality. We always need quality. And the problem is that performing data analytics, when you do it on context-free data, of course you get correlations, but some of those correlations will be spurious and will lack the quality that you need. If you can find ways to add context as a feature into your analytics, then perhaps we can impute causality, which will enhance the value of the analysis dramatically. This is one of the things we're working on at Ryerson University. I'd love to keep you posted on this, so keep an eye on our website. Now, let me just put to bed one of my things that drives me crazy. People say, oh, privacy stifles innovation, get rid of it. Are you kidding me? Privacy breeds innovation and creativity, because if you really want to build in privacy into your system, you've got to be very creative, you've got to be smart, and you've got to figure out how to do this. So reject notions of privacy leading to anything other than creative solutions. It's at the heart of it, challenging traditional views of looking at this. And here's a couple of people who are doing this, a couple of areas. So the Privacy Internet Engineering Task Force have been looking at privacy by design, and they're really focusing on it in terms of how can we consider privacy in the design of protocols and other things. So many different organizations are now looking at this from an engineering perspective. Carnegie Mellon University in the United States, they now have a master's degree for privacy engineers. There's an actual privacy engineering master's program. And they're focusing on privacy by design. How can you do this? How can you code for this? Really getting specific. And OASIS, I co-chair a technical committee of OASIS, an international standards body, the Privacy by Design for Software Engineers Committee. And we've just finished the first draft of a sort of a playbook to give to engineers and computer scientists. How do you do this to make it really simple? Well, it's not simple, but to make it very specific. So this is coming out too. Keep your eyes on this. Yeah, we just did the documentation for software engineers version 1.0. No doubt this will change in the next year once we finalize it, but we're off to a good start. And finally, I just want to walk you through some of the big data papers we've done. And it's all about, the first one we did with Jeff Jonas, who is with IBM, and it was about how do you integrate context into big data analyses. I loved it. And then we've done many papers with Drummond Reed, with the Respect Network. We just finished a paper with Deloitte on ensuring that you can have big data innovation without compromising privacy. And it's interesting, this paper we did with ITIF, we put this paper out because we wanted to tell people you can de-identify data. We said setting the record straight, because there were a lot of articles coming out saying you can't de-identify. It will invariably lead to re-identification. So we put this out, and then we were attacked like you would not believe by many of the, what I call purists, who said it's nonsense, pointing to the popular examples of re-identification that have failed, the AOL, or that have succeeded. The AOL example, Netflix, there's the New York City taxi drivers, all of which they thought were de-identified, and in fact, they weren't. They were able to re-identify. In each of those cases, so we have a rebuttal to those comments. In each of those cases, I've worked with Professor Khaled El-Imam to show how poor the quality of the de-identification was. So, of course, if you start out with bad de-identification, you're going to increase the likelihood of re-identification, especially among determined attackers. So this dance will continue for a long time. Stay tuned. I just don't want you to think that you have to abandon efforts at de-identifying data sets before using them, which immediately enhances the privacy, just even associated with people working on the data. People work on the data, the actual, whoever you have in your company, if they can get a de-identified data set, you immediately minimize the risk of rogue employees, inside jobs. A lot of those times, the results are very positive. And this is my favorite paper. It's the most recent one with Professor El-Imam. And we talk very specifically about how you can do this de-identification thing and make it work for you. So just to summarize, we have many arguments against privacy in terms of stifling innovation and big data analytics. I urge you to reject them. They're not true in my view. And I think you can go a long way by embedding privacy proactively from the outset. Now, I have a dilemma. I have 45 seconds left, and I really want to tell you about smart data. Smart data is all about embedding into intelligent agents the protections necessary to protect your data. And they travel through the cloud, and they have the permissible uses of data with them. Oh, I've gotten 3 more minutes. Oh, you're a good man. Okay, I'm gonna go real fast. You could take a look at this later. But it's all about, it's a different form of IT, bottom up, not top down, and it's all about developing evolutionary robotics in a way that the data learn as the experience continues. I'm not going to go into detail about this. It's all about user control. It's amazing, because can you really rely on the government to protect your data, or even businesses? If you had data that protected itself, wouldn't that be amazing? We have specific protocols that we're working on. So I'd love you to take a look at our website if you're interested in some of this work. I'm not going to go into this top-down versus rule-based, evolutionary robotics design. So this is a combination of top-down and bottom-up, and embraces both. Okay, now I'm going to tell you about one more thing that we developed. How do you do surveillance and privacy? How can you do privacy by design and surveillance? Can you do the two? You know what my answer is going to be. Of course. Positive sum, not zero sum. Not easy to do, but how do you do it? We did a paper, again with Professor Khaled El-Imam, that explores a methodology using partial homomorphic encryption to create software agents that go after, put them in a huge database, the NSA database, but they're blind to any information they come across except for the information that they're programmed to find. And I'm not going to go into the specifics because I now have 1.5 minutes left. But what I want to tell you is if you have something that has the appearance of a viable model, people will listen. So I've been invited to present this paper at the Pentagon by the Department of Defense in the United States. Twice I've gone to the Pentagon. They're very interested in this. I have no idea if it'll go anywhere. But the point is, they're looking for solutions that consider privacy and surveillance. I'm not going to tell them, forget about surveillance. Obviously, that's not going to fly. But if you can develop a model that will accommodate privacy interests and enable surveillance in terms of the terrorists, and I just have to point to ISIS now, because I think that that's going to lead to a resurgence of interest in surveillance. Let's develop some models which enable positive sum solutions and ensure a greater level of privacy than the existing systems right now, which basically is non-existent. So these are some of my notes on how we do. We use probabilistic graphical modeling, Bayesian networks, etc. I'm not going to go into it. You can take a look at all of this on our website. And I'm also not going to summarize it, but the essence of it is you can do both. You can develop these agents. They will find, hopefully, the bad guys in a more targeted way. And once you develop the probabilistic model that says, yeah, I think this hit has an 85% likelihood of being a bad guy, and we should then send it to the police to investigate. You take that to the court. You get a warrant. You present the evidence, you get the warrant, then be my guest. Do your work. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me end it off by saying what I've been trying to hopefully drive home, that it's all about privacy and functionality, privacy and engineering, privacy and computer science and code. Marry the two together. I don't want you to separate one from the other. One is intrinsically involved in the other, and when you do marry the two together, you get a wonderful, successful outcome. I've tested this with lots of different academic circles as well as companies that are very interested in pursuing this. If you have any interest in pursuing this, please contact me, and I would love to partner with you in some capacity. I just want to drive this forward so that our future, the future of our children, can have both privacy and functionality. We have to offer a future to our children that embraces privacy and freedom. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.